All right, welcome back, everyone. So, back finally enjoying the comfort of my own home once again, although Texas was quite nice, I must say. And good seeing y'all here. Yeah, it's like I have the chat open down here so I can follow along. Hey, Cassie Hansen, good to see you. Yeah. Victor, my love from the UK. Good having you here. Thank you. Oswaldo Corrales, good to see you also. Thank you. Yeah, good to see you all. All right, folks, have a few big updates. I want to go a bit into what Trump is up to because there's some new updates on this. I also want to go a bit into what's happening with the elections because we have some information now that many of you may have not heard about Trump, for example, actually winning a lot of court cases and the Supreme Court actually possibly hearing some major cases soon. And honestly, if you weren't reading some of the few news outlets that cover this stuff, you might not have even heard about it. So, some good updates to go into. As usual, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. All right, that's it. Let's jump into it. Now, first story I want to go over. This is Epoch Times. According to a senior advisor with Trump, Trump is mulling whether to launch his own social media platform. And this is something I've been suggesting that he might do. Of course, it's pure speculation on my part before, but it seems like he might be moving on it now, according to the senior advisor. Now, let's go into it a bit, and I'll give kind of my own take on what this could mean, actually, because keep in mind, you can't just at this point start a social media. If you're going to start a social media at this point, you have to build the infrastructure as well, because as Parler found, you can't just put your social media on other people's services. They can delete your entire company essentially on a whim if they deem that something one person says on your platform they don't like goes against their own values or personal interests. They can delete it. And so this goes a lot deeper than just starting a social media if he does do it. But let's go into this a bit. All right. Some folks are asking, have I seen the Times article yet? Yes, I have. We're going to go into that. So give us a little bit. All right, real quick. It says Jason Miller, senior advisor to former President Donald Trump, said on February 6th that Trump is deciding how he will reemerge on social media, including considering whether to create his own platform. And this is according to Miller telling Breitbart News on February 6th on radio channel Sirius XM 125. He said, quote, I would expect that we will see the president reemerge on social media. And keep in mind his options are quite limited right now. Now, real quick, Parler may be starting up again as soon as tomorrow, according to their latest updates. Remember, they kicked out Mates, the former CEO. Who knows what the real story was inside, but it seems to be the case they're trying to relaunch soon. They may be relaunching as early as tomorrow. So maybe that's a social media platform he'll go to. There were rumors that Trump would be going to Gab, this other new social media platform. Well, it's been around for a while now, but newer. He does not seem to have done that yet. And there's allegations on Gab on why that is. The Gab CEO is blaming Jared Kushner. Who knows what the real story is? But there's also the real possibility Trump may be starting his own social media platform because, as we've seen, Parler's great. It's limited still in terms of what you can do with it. Right? It's basically a Twitter replacement. And, it's pretty mature as such. But if Trump wanted to have a social media platform with everything he had before, he would need a Facebook type feature. He would also need a YouTube type feature. And if he wanted to get involved with community organizing, as he's saying it, very likely he'd need some kind of community organizing feature as well, like Facebook groups, which I don't think Parler at this point has, meaning that it's possible he may be starting his own platform. Let's go into this just a bit more. Now, he said this, he continued. This is according again to Jason Miller, senior advisor to former President Donald Trump. Continuing, whether that's joining an existing platform or creating his new platform, there are a number of different options and a number of different meetings that they've been having on that front. Nothing is imminent on that. And Miller added, all options are on the table, right? When talk about the different plans with this. He said a number of things are being discussed, so stay tuned. Stay tuned. There are So stay tuned, there are, because he's going to be back on social media. We're just kind of figuring out which avenue makes the most sense. I won't go too much deeper into that. But again, it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. Even if Trump decides to go on Parler, even if he decides to go with Gab, remember that the guys who run these companies are themselves being hit with different types of censorship, right? Parler, the worst case scenario, was just deleted, right? Amazon Web Services deleted their service, right? Shut them down overnight. Apple, Google, other companies, of course, also went after them in different ways. They're dealing with this. And as well, it's difficult for them to restart it because they can't find a platform. Gab, as well, has been having similar problems. Gab CEO allegedly even targeted on the finance front, where it's hard for him to even get a credit card at this point, right? Yeah, Rhonda Neal, I'm just waiting for a user-friendly platform. I hear you. Yeah. There's a few out there, actually. I mentioned SafeChat's pretty good. There's a few others I know that are in the works, hint, hint. But none too mature yet, and none that have a ton of users yet. And so really they need either someone like Trump to jump on it to bring in the whole crowd, or they need some kind of incident to really promote it. Parler is the best positioned for that. And if not Parler, then really is Trump starting his own. The point I was getting at, though, is if Trump actually does build this, it's not just going to be a platform. It's going to be very likely all the infrastructure as well. Servers, DNS, right? Basically, the core infrastructure you would need to run a tech company. And if he does do that, there's actually a possibility, if he builds the technology and infrastructure for it, we could see him build the other things that we need to go along with that. You would think, for example, web servers, a service like Amazon Web Services, for example, because if you were going to have a stable system, it needs to be able to grow, and it needs to be stable enough to withstand cyber attacks. There aren't a whole lot of platforms that do that outside the big services. Aside from that, you would also need something that's not going to shut you down, on a whim one day. Options for that are quite limited. You also need something that could withstand the types of political attacks that these other companies are going through. One of the reasons why any platform that hosts Trump at this time is going to put a big target on their back, because the weakest link is going to be the biggest target. They're going to go to these, media do this all the time. They write hit pieces on you. Then they'll go to your advertisers or your services or whatever they want to target it, based on whatever advocacy thing they're doing. And they'll say, oh, do you support this, person based on this narrative I'm framing? They can frame, for example, a media like yours truly, right, as representing a value they don't support, and then go to those media and say, do you support this value? And of course they're going to say no, and they're going to say, then why do you allow them to use their services? They shut them down. Simple as that. Imagine now if Trump tries to go to a platform and he's relying on key services, they're going to be targeted left, right, and center. Meaning that if Trump is going to make that happen, even if he does go to something like Parler, anyone, not just the platform itself, but anyone affiliated with it is going to be targeted as well. And then you have to think about financing, because as well, you're going to deal with ad networks, other systems. And if Trump does get behind building something like this, and if he's going to do it in any kind of stable way, that's very likely going to be the path he has to go down. If he's going to do it in any kind of stable way, we're going to see not just social media, we're also going to see very likely an ad network, right, to finance it, and possibly as well infrastructure. In other words, maybe even something they will rent out publicly. Now, this is speculation, but again, if Trump is going to do this, based on the situation right now, he would have few other options than to build these things in addition to it, because you just can't do it these days otherwise. All right, let's go on a bit deeper into this, because there's a few updates with Trump now. This is another story. This is Trump Jr., Don Jr. He said, here's what comes next for our amazing movement. All right, let's go into this. It says here, this is Epoch Times. Donald Trump Jr., the son of former President Donald Trump, said that efforts from the former president and his team to advance the interests of the United States are continuing. He characterized such efforts as a, quote, movement of the people against the elite. And in a video on Trump Jr.'s social media accounts headlined, "Here's what comes next for our amazing movement," he told supporters, quote, "Just want to make sure everyone knows, guys, we are not done yet." Now, Trump Jr. then shared a recent video clip that showed his father, Donald Trump, walking off the golf course while saying, "We haven't finished yet." Now, this is Trump Jr. said this. He said he's actually accurate, commenting on what Donald Trump said. He said, "The reality is this movement isn't over. All the blood, sweat, and tears that you guys have all put into this thing is very much still alive and well. You see that, I mean. This is really a movement of the people, a movement against the establishment, a movement against the elite." And he continued, quote, "A lot of those things have been brewing for quite some time, like the Tea Party movement, for example. Ironically, even some of the Bernie bros are more anti-establishment as well, just on the Democrat side, even though I can't get behind the socialist idea. A lot of them did end up voting for Trump because they're anti-establishment, right? It is bigger than just this, and it's been going on for a while, but he continues, right? A lot of those things have been brewing for quite some time. And that's why, for me, I'm still standing engaged, and we're going to get in there and fight to elect people who really represent the people. People like you who have gone through so much." And this is interesting here. He said, "I'm still standing engaged. We're going to get in there and fight to elect people who really represent the people." Meaning that, again, the Trump movement is no longer just Trump running for re-election, or it's very likely they're not going to be able to impeach him just based on the votes. So that aside, right, that possibility aside, it's not just about Trump running for president at this point. The Trump movement at this point, and again, Trump, through his office of the former president, has said, based on very vague statements, because we haven't got a lot of details on it, other than his initial letter, Trump has said that under his office of the former president, this new office he established just recently, he's going to be getting engaged in grassroots, community organizing, which is kind of ironic, those of you who know the roots of the word, because that's like Saul Alinsky, radical communist level type stuff. Barack Obama was a community organizer. Typically stuff you only see on kind of the far left, not even the left, right? Community organizing. Trump's going to get involved in community organizing. And he's also going to be working on getting new politicians to run for office. Now, what that actually means in practice, we'll have to see. But we do know, right, that one of those focuses is going to be basically not overturning, but fighting to have Republicans retake the House and Senate come 2022, 2 years. And we know that based on the way that the U.S. system works, right, you don't just have people go in and put their names on a ballot or maybe be write-ins and hope people vote for them, right? That is not how our system works. For the American system to work, you need to have people campaign. And as part of the campaign process, you need to make them criticize things that they see as not being right within the current situation. And you need to have talking points. You need to have policies. You need to have action. Not just again, the politician, but the grassroots. People going out and petitioning, putting up billboards, putting up signs, talking to friends and family. That is how our election system works. And if Trump starts getting involved in that, what are you going to see? You're going to see a movement, right, brought to life through the grassroots, meaning through Trump supporters or people who become Trump supporters or supporters of this new movement in general he creates, not just him now, right? Again, this is no longer just about Trump. This is the movement he's starting to get other people elected, not just about Trump getting elected. Meaning, again, that the Trump movement is growing beyond just the office of the president. And as well, we can expect that as they start rolling this out, right? As they start rolling this out, we're going to see them start getting involved with the narrative across the country. And as we mentioned just a second ago, in order to have that narrative, they need an outlet, which they don't currently have. You need media coverage. How many media are actually going to cover this? Maybe Trump doesn't need media coverage. He goes right to the people. But at the very least, he's going to need social media. He's going to need a place to organize. He's going to need a place to organize. He's going to need a place where they can campaign. He's going to need a place where people can communicate. And currently there's no place for that, meaning that maybe they have to build it. Something very interesting to watch, but they are now saying this is what they're going to be doing. And we're going down to the Trump impeachment. I'll be explaining a bit some of the updates on that. They don't have the votes for it, let's just be honest. But they're coming out now in terms of their defense, and I'll be talking about that in just a minute. Let me go a bit more into what Don Jr. is saying, and then we'll go into some questions. Now, Don Jr. said that based on, again, what's happening, saying people like you have gone through so much, Don Jr. said that Trump is going to be in that fight. And he said, I know he's still going to keep going. I know there's a lot against us. We always have been, right? And he continues, adding that his father is going to be in there making sure that we have people who truly represent what America is all about. Now, I won't go too deep into this, but again, this is where things are at. We can expect a lot more discussion on this. We can expect a revitalization of the battle for the narrative. And this is important, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, right? No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, if every branch of government, legislative, judicial, executive, and even the fourth estate, the media, and now they're saying big business is the new fourth estate. So maybe there's 5 estates now, including big business. Although I'd argue big business and media aren't too far from each other these days, given that, again, how many corporations? 6 corporations control just about every mainstream news outlet. They're the same thing, right? If every estate of our government, all the checks and balances to make sure wrongdoing isn't happening, are walking in lockstep with each other, and if even the average American citizen tries to question that lockstep, you yourself can be criticized and targeted, what then keeps government in check, right? What keeps government in check if they're all marching in lockstep with each other? Nothing. And to the extent that even if you as a private citizen try to question them, they can criticize you, shut you down, or in the worst case scenario, if you choose to publicly organize, try to label you as a terrorist, it seems at this point. This is where our society is at. And if you don't have some system keeping things in check and calling things out when there's wrongdoing that is even able to do that, then you're moving towards a tyranny, right? I would argue no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, this is a good thing. All right, let's go deeper into... Actually, let me go over a few questions, and I'll go into some more stories, right? All right, so this is first off from the Fields Bros. You said, how do you see Secretary of State Blinken, the new Secretary of State, alongside others within intelligence, pushing back against Biden's weak stance towards China publicly? There actually have been a few updates on that. The Chinese Communist Party actually just recently... just real quick, Marvelous Marvel, you said, hello, Josh, you know who owns SafeChat? I believe SafeChat is through Sound of Hope Radio, which is another Chinese dissident-run media organization, not part of Epoch Times, but different. They're pretty good, actually. I would trust SafeChat if you're looking for a good one. I'm on there, although I'm not that active, to be honest. I'm not that active on any social media right now until Parler gets back up, just being honest. But we'll see what else comes up. But back on this question, you're asking, how does the new Secretary of State, Blinken, position himself on China when Biden is pretty soft on China? We do see him calling out the Chinese Communist Party still on human rights abuses. He actually just called out the CCP on persecution of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and I can't remember the third one. It wasn't Falun Gong. I don't think it was Christians. It might have been Hong Kong democracy activists, I think it was, which the CCP actually got angry about. They did call them out, and they said, you can't cross this line. The Chinese Communist Party is again trying to put lines in the sand, saying, don't cross this line. This is where it's at. If you cross this line, we're gonna, I don't know, call you names at this point or something like that. It's not quite clear yet, right? Now, we have seen him stand up against the CCP to an extent. We do see them, for example, positioning themselves with Japan, suggesting they're going to maintain this new Quad alliance with Japan, India, and Australia against the Chinese Communist Party. We do see signs as well that he's continuing to criticize the CCP, and they're maintaining what they call freedom of navigation exercises, where they basically just sail ships, military ships or otherwise, through the South China Sea and East China Sea, right? Meaning that they're maintaining some of these things. The important things to watch going forward, and we haven't seen any movement on this yet, the important things to watch going forward really are whether Biden goes after the Chinese Communist Party still, if for example, they do things that are highly unethical, whether he still criticizes them and then acts on that criticism, in other words, sanctioning them. The other piece of this is whether he just maintains things as they are. Really, if Biden just keeps the sanctions Trump put into place in place, if he does nothing, if he just keeps things as they are, it will actually be pretty bad for the Chinese Communist Party. With the one exception that the CCP tries to, which they're doing, which they're trying to build their own currency, this digital currency, and they try to create a separate financial system to challenge the US dollar-led financial system, meaning they can get around the sanctions, which would mean Biden has to be very aggressive diplomatically with other countries to ensure the CCP doesn't basically dominate through that new thing they're starting. The worst case scenario is if he gets rid of the sanctions, if he gets rid of these policies, it's kind of bad, even though if left unchecked through their new digital currency, that's also going to be just as bad, arguably. If Biden doesn't push back against this new financial warfare front, the CCP is going to be pushing very hard on that. The big issue you have with China, though, is foreign direct investment. It's American investors, Wall Street bankers pouring money into the CCP. And unfortunately, even Trump didn't really put a stop to that. He did to an extent with the sanctions, right? But really, a lot of the money was still pouring into the Chinese Communist Party. The last movie made labeling the Chinese Communist Party, designating the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Muslim Uyghurs as a genocide, really should have ended a lot of that direct investment, because these are people now investing in a genocidal regime. They're not being called out for that. Let's see. This is from the Rot Machine. You said, "Are we still in the Cold War?" It's hard to say what I wouldn't. The Cold War would be a very specific label. You could say we are engaged in a Cold War-like scenario with the Chinese Communist Party. Some would argue, including myself, the Cold War never technically ended. Just the U.S. put down its defenses. Because the powers that be continued doing everything that they planned to do anyways. There was the perestroika deception, for example. There was, for example, the continuation of the Soviet regime's systems for what they call ideological subversion. And there's the Chinese Communist Party's use of unrestricted warfare and the many systems of warfare under that umbrella. Financial warfare, legal warfare, economic warfare, business warfare, which are different. Economic warfare targeting GDP, business warfare targeting businesses, financial warfare targeting currencies, so on, right? Culture warfare, media warfare, legal, like Hollywood, right? Culture warfare, legal warfare using international legal systems, media warfare controlling outlets of information. List goes on and on and on. They're extremely aggressive on all of these. They have written doctrine on all of these. And yes, they are waging war on us through these in their own words. The issue is that until Trump came in, the U.S. was not fighting back on that front. And this wasn't a Republican Democrat thing. George Bush was just as bad as Barack Obama when it came to this. None of them really did anything with it. Real quick, this is from Pretty Thankful. He said, "Hi, Josh. What exactly is the position of a progressive? What is their ideology?" Well, I'd say there's a difference between people who might consider themselves progressive versus what the concept actually does represent. If you want to talk about most people these days who call themselves progressive, they might mean that they're more liberal-minded and they support kind of new progressive policies like, the transgender movement or, BLM or things like that. If you want to get into the actual meaning of the term of progress within the political concept, right? This ties into Marx, Karl Marx, and his idea of social evolution. Again, Marx's idea of communism was this 5 stages of social evolution. The pre-communist society, right? Primitive communism, like cavemen type stuff, the agrarian society, the consummate empire, you would call it, capitalism, socialism being the dictatorship of the proletariat where the government controls everything, and then finally the collapse of the socialist system into communism, when all previously existing institutions have failed or collapsed and you have a free, quote unquote, man, right? Basically, what communism, if you really get into it, what communism really seeks to do is remake mankind in the image not of man, and not of God, right? Tradition and things like this, but in the image of man. It looks to, and to do that, they need to destroy everything that was created through the old order, right? Anything that was created through the idea of a belief in a higher power needs to be destroyed under the communist idea. Faith, family, religion, tradition, the economic systems, political systems, even, which is the ironic time bomb within even the socialist system, creating finally again a new society recreated in the image of man. That is what communism aims for. And again, the process of that is destruction, destroying all previously existing institutions, including morality, including religion. It says it right in the Communist Manifesto, that communism abolishes eternal truths. And those of you who are religious, what is truth, right? And it also says that communism destroys all religion and all morality, right? It's not just an economic theory. Now, when you talk about progress, this again ties into the idea of social evolution, the progress along the lines of the social evolution, moving towards the system of communism, because Marx believed that this was the way things happened, right? Dialectical materialism, the living soul of Marxism, as they called it, was a system to basically incite struggle. You want to have, what they call social struggle, or, the fight and things like this. They want a far right and a far left. They want people to fight on the streets. They want clashes because they believe, even back to the Hegelian dialectic, which Marx adopted, that conflict leads forward. That was the concept. Because if you believe in social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, leading to the speeding up of the evolutionary process on the social level as they interpreted it, you could speed up social evolution by instigating survival of the fittest scenarios. Famines, genocide, you name it, right? That's what communism seeks to do. And you could say that all communist systems in practice are socialism, because communism is merely the belief that guides the system. Communism exists through the negation of systems. And I could go into this for quite a while, but end it there. Again, we're working on a communism series where I can explain all this stuff more in depth, but hope that answered your question. I'll do one more question, then we'll go a bit deeper into some of the stories. Let's see, this is from Kerry King. He said, do you think they will still try to impeach Biden? You have a newcomer Republican politician who's been, I can't remember her name at this moment, but she's been very active. There are articles of impeachment against Biden. They don't technically have the votes, though. And so really it's more just a narrative thing, or, them trying to basically hold the Democrats under the same, standards as they hold the Republicans, basically. In reality, the Republicans don't have the votes to impeach Biden. It's a pipe dream at this point, to be honest. But if Trump can overturn, well, one, there's still a lot of lawsuits going through on the elections, to be honest. There's still a lot of lawsuits going on, which could actually impact things. And in addition to that, there's also the possibility, which Trump's going to be working towards, as his son, Don Jr. has stated, and as he stated with his office, the former president, they're going to be working to take back the House and Senate. Now, they would need a 2/3 majority in the Senate if they wanted to impeach, which is, again, why the current attempts to impeach Trump are probably not going to work. They would need a 2/3 majority, but if they did have that, they might try to impeach him. And that might take 2 years, but we'll have to see what happens in a couple years. All right, folks, let's go over a few more stories. Next up here, I'll go over this briefly because it's some stuff we've talked about, but it's just reinforcing it. It says here, Trump impeachment defense to attack the process. In other words, they're arguing that the entire process this entire impeachment is based upon should not even legally be allowed to have happened in the first place. Let's explain this. It says the attorneys for former President Donald Trump will make procedural objections a focus during the Senate impeachment trial next week, including by questioning whether Trump can be tried as a private citizen, one of his attorneys said. Now, House Democrats, joined by 10 Republicans, impeached Trump on a single charge of inciting a mob. They said it breached the Capitol on January 6th. In a trial memorandum, Trump attorneys denied the allegations and challenged the constitutionality of trying Trump after he had left office. And attorney Bruce Castor Jr. told Reuters, quote, "This is law school 101 stuff. This isn't advanced legal treatises in bound volumes that are used in the Supreme Court as reference. We're trying to win a case on a bunch of procedural objections." I won't go too much deeper into that because we've explained it quite a bit before. But basically, they need a 2/3 majority to impeach Trump. They only had like 5 Republicans saying they're going to support it, meaning they're like 12 votes short. And their ability to win those right now doesn't seem very high. In addition to that, again, Chief Justice Roberts is not going to be overseeing this. And according to the Constitution, if you impeach a president, you need to have the Chief Justice overseeing it. He's not overseeing it because the Constitution only supports impeaching a sitting president, not a former president. The whole thing is wild, just being honest. And we could get into the details of it again. Those of you who watch a show regularly, I've gone over it quite often, so I won't go too deep into the details again. But Democrats don't have a very strong chance of impeaching at this point. Let's just be honest. But let's go a bit deeper into this now, because there's a bit more I want to go into with you. Now, I mentioned briefly that Parler may be back online soon. As we mentioned in a recent episode, Parler CEO, Mr. Mates, was removed from his position as CEO by the board. It seemed there was a bit of internal infighting. We can assume, it's not clear, we can assume based on just the surface picture that maybe there were some disagreements with how to get back online, essentially, because those of you who are on Parler, this technically a Twitter replacement, those of you who are on it know that, again, you can't access it right now. They have a landing page website you can log in, you can just go to, not even log into. But if you want to tweet, or whatever they call it, parlay, if you want to communicate with people on it, it's gone, right? Now they're saying this. They're saying here, Parler co-owners saying site could be back up February 8th. And those of you keeping track, February 8th is tomorrow. They're saying things are looking good for a re-platform of the social media website Parler, a co-owner said late Thursday. And the co-owner, Dan Bongino, said on Fox News' Hannity, quote, "We're shooting for Monday. Monday looks good, fingers crossed." That is tomorrow. According to Bongino, possibly tomorrow, Parler could be back online. We'll have to see if it happens. Now, Bongino didn't provide any further information on this, and so that's all we have to go on right now. We do know there was a bit of a shakeup internally. We don't know the nature of it. We can assume they were looking for ways to get back online, and it appeared they had some disagreements with that. Parler possibly back online tomorrow, and then the big question with Trump is going to be answered. Does Trump go to Parler, or does Trump create his own platform, right? And we mentioned earlier in this episode that the Trump team is saying that that is being considered. Now, one big thing to consider right now, Trump right now has, all right, so Parler right now has momentum, first off, because anybody unhappy right now with Facebook censorship, Twitter censorship, even YouTube censorship, because actually, I don't know if you all know it, Parler actually gives you the ability to publish full videos. You can publish really long videos on Parler, like full 2-hour episodes of stuff. It actually has the infrastructure for it, or it had it. Hopefully it'll still have it. Meaning that Parler actually has a really good video function as well. Parler, anyone now unhappy with these platforms, unhappy with being censored, maybe even concerned about their own personal security at this point, or just looking to follow the crowd because you're going to have a lot of users going to Parler now, are going to move to it. You're going to have a huge influx going to Parler. In addition to that, whatever Trump goes to first is going to have a huge influx of just about anybody who wants to hear from Trump. And that is not just Trump supporters, right? That's going to be the media, right? Well, mainstream media. That's going to be businesses. That's going to be anybody looking to keep track of what Trump is talking about. And so whichever platform Trump moves to and starts his official account on first is going to be the one that essentially gets that huge boost of viewers and anyone looking to come with him. Meaning that whichever one he jumps to is going to be the one that gets that first influx. Now, the question is it more strategically viable for him to go to Parler and place his bets essentially on the hope that Parler has found a stable enough server and systems that it can withstand the types of political and business-led attacks that they may be facing as soon as they start up, especially if Trump goes there? Do they have it strong enough? And second, is it more viable for them to do that or to just start their own platform or do both? We'll have to see. Trump, of course, didn't just have a Twitter account. He had Facebook, YouTube, and so on. Maybe he'll do both. We'll have to see. All right, let's see a few other stories here I want to go into. Actually, okay, this is a good talking point for those of you who have been talking to friends about what happened in 2020. Epoch Times here. It says, Trump won 2/3 of election lawsuits where merits considered. Now, those of you who've seen the many mainstream news articles saying that every claim of fraud was debunked, those articles have lied to you. Anyone who's been told or read in news articles that every single Trump case was rejected and failed and no evidence was presented, those people are either lying to you or they have no idea what they're talking about. Let me explain. Let's go over this a bit. It says, the claim often repeated by the mainstream media, social media content moderators, and fact checkers that lawsuits filed by President Donald Trump campaign and Republicans were initially dismissed by courts is untrue, according to a new analysis. The findings do not necessarily suggest that if the lawsuits had all been decided before Joe Biden was certified as official winner in the presidential election by Congress on January 7th, that former President Trump could have won the hotly contested election, nor would they necessarily have affected many of the electoral college votes won by Biden in the disputed battleground states. Some of the legal victories took place in states like Colorado and Iowa, where the popular vote count for the respective winners of those states, Biden in Colorado and Trump in Iowa, were not close. Of those 22 cases that have been heard by the courts and decided on their merits, Trump and Republicans have prevailed in 15. 15 out of 22, Trump won. According to citizen journalist John Droz Jr., a physicist and environmental advocate in Morehead City, North Carolina. This means Trump has won 2/3 of the cases fully adjudicated by the courts. In other words, in cases where it was actually heard by the courts, where the courts actually looked into the evidence and ruled on it, Trump won 2/3 of those. Now, Droz and a team of volunteers dug through court filings and legal minutiae to track down 81 lawsuits that were filed in connection with the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election. The lawsuits are tracked to Droz's publicly available spreadsheet that was current as of February 6th. Of the 81 cases, 11 were withdrawn or consolidated, and 23 were dismissed for lack of standing or on other grounds. And at this point, that can mean anything. Both the cohort of 11 and of 23 should not be considered wins or losses for either side, Droz said, because they have nothing to do with the merits of the case. And this leaves 47 cases. Of those 47 cases, 22 have been finalized after the court heard the arguments, considered the evidence, and then issued a ruling. Of those 22, again, Trump or Republicans won 15 and lost 7, according to analysis. This leaves 25 lawsuits that have not yet been disposed of, still ongoing. Meaning when courts actually hear the cases, again, 2/3 won by Trump or Republicans. Now, this was a bizarre, moving on a bit, this was a bizarre story in time. I'm sure many of you have seen this. I know one of you asked about it earlier. Honestly, very strangely timed and very, very strange in general. And let me go into it and then I'll explain, right? Now, keep in mind, this came out right around the time when Mike Lindell released his documentary. This came out, Mike Lindell made a documentary on election fraud. YouTube, Vimeo deleted it almost right away, and he got censored left and right on it. And at the same time as well, this happened right as what media was it? Not PJ Media. Gateway Pundit, I'm sorry. Gateway Pundit had their videos showing surveillance cameras of some fraud taking place as well. Right around this time, right then, actually, Time releases this story. And it says here, the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. And it says here, a weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take to the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about the violence. Instead, an eerie quiet descended. And I won't go too deep into this because there's a lot of fluff, right? Now, let's go into this. It says here, but further down, there was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. What does this mean? How do you curtail protests, whether Democrat or Republican, and coordinate resistance from CEOs? This means then that there was coordination around the elections, including resistance among CEOs, meaning that the CEOs in these big companies acted in a coordinated manner. Not a very smart move to make when you have, people getting censored and them trying to prove that there's a conspiracy. In other words, multiple people collaborating with the set goal of censorship. Let's go into this now. It says both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. Meaning here, business titans, maybe CEOs and others, and left-wing activists were working together, right? It says the pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain, inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. Now, it says the handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election. An extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free, fair, and credible and uncorrupted. Yeah, right. Let's go. Keep in mind, this is Time. Let's go into a bit more. It says for more than a year, meaning they were working on this far beforehand. A loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. This is Time magazine, remember, right? All right. They said now most of this took place in the left. It was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, blah, 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 right? I won't go too deep into this, a bit more. Essentially, it's saying there were democracy campaigners, grassroots activists, CEOs, and so on, working to change election laws across the country, right? Which is kind of funny because they're saying this is about protecting the election, when in reality, what they did was loosened election standards, which is why there's so many issues right now with the election and why people are still questioning it. It's why we still have, again, 2/3 of cases being won by Trump and the Supreme Court possibly hearing some new ones. I'll talk about that in just a minute. They're saying this thing was coordinated by the grassroots, coordinated by political activists, and coordinated by CEOs, meaning that if this whole thing plays out and we see that, hey, maybe something did happen, you have conspiracy here. And what do you call it when groups working together for more than a year in a conspiracy to change the outcome of an election are found to have coordinated on it again, right? What do you call that? That's a coup, right? That's sedition. It's what they're accusing Trump of doing right now. Here we are, right? Let me go a bit deeper into this now, because there's that, yeah, collusion. That's right. Now that's one, and this is important. It's one thing to have things happen in grassroots, random areas because people are, politically inclined to do things. It's another thing to do things knowingly. When you are knowingly collaborating, right? That is a totally different charge. If people are knowingly collaborating to overturn an election, to change election laws, to weaken election standards, which is what they really did, right? Whether it meant not having signatures checked, which again was determined to have been illegal in Virginia, whether it was changing election laws and bypassing state legislatures like they did in, for example, Pennsylvania, whether it was other issues. We could go for a long time into this, right? You've all seen the documentaries, I hope, by this point, right? To do that randomly is one thing. To do that knowingly and in a coordinated manner is a whole other issue. And that is where things would get really serious. And actually, it's very bizarre that Time would release the story right now. What you find media doing a lot of times is what you would call crisis control, meaning that new information is coming out that could throw a wrench into their whole narrative or political interest. And so they have a journalist somewhere write this, do an investigation, and they oftentimes do it early. The journalist oftentimes may or may not even know that they're doing this, but the media company can choose then to release that story at a strategic moment. The strategic moment being when the narrative that they're trying to defend is under assault. Crisis control. They do this all the time. What is the crisis? Mike Lindell's documentary maybe had about 10 million views on it, which is pretty dang high, before it got deleted very quickly. Still on BitChute, I believe. That happened. And then you also had, again, Gateway Pundit get their video footage, surveillance video footage of, say, serious, say, shady looking activity take place on election night, which notably Twitter deleted their entire account after they started talking about it. Maybe it was these two issues combined that made them feel like they need to control the crisis. Pure speculation and analysis, of course, because we don't know what the real intention was. But it's a very strange article to basically come out and admit that there was collaboration, that there was collusion in a way to change the outcome of the election and weaken the standards on the election, but to frame it otherwise, to frame it like these guys are heroes for doing this. It's such a bizarre story to see, and such a bizarre way of framing what took place, and in a very partisan manner as well. That it's hard to see it as being anything other than that. But again, we don't know what their intentions are, so we can only state this based on, what we perceive, right? Now, let's go a bit deeper into some of what's happening with the election. First off, I mentioned Mike Lindell. YouTube and Vimeo have taken down his election fraud video. And they're saying this. They said, per our presidential election integrity policy, which they didn't have it in place last election, we removed content uploaded after the safe harbor deadline. This was not the standard before. How many people had hashtag not my president, and how many people were even organizing mass protests, and even public officials calling for violence, including public leaders, after Trump was elected, right? These media were not doing this. Their entire idea of saying you can't criticize the election after the safe harbor deadline is a new standard that they themselves decided to put in place because it fits their political interests, right? Let's go deeper into this, because there's a few other points with this. Now, this is an important point with the January 6th narrative. This is Gateway Pundit. They're saying here, even CNN even admits there's still no evidence Capitol Officer Sicknick was killed by blunt force to the head on January 6th. Real quick on this, because this really does away with one of the big narratives. One of the big narratives they've been pushing. This is Gateway Pundit, another story. Now, remember, Trump was giving his speech. He was encouraging people to go protest at the Capitol building to encourage, in his own words, to encourage Republicans to make the right choice in voting for the dueling electors, because you had dueling electors in 7 states with the Electoral College vote. This was, of course, people at the time when Trump was still speaking were breaching the Capitol building, some police are seen waving them in and opening the gates, and Capitol Police, right? And there's, of course, the narrative was used after that to basically go after Trump supporters and to try to impeach Trump himself. But one of the big narratives on this, again, right? The narrative is an officer, they said it was violent, right? The violent Trump protest that led to 5 people being killed. The information's coming out now what actually happened. First off, Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was shot in the neck, she was killed by Capitol Police. The other three other individuals died of health complications, and the officer who was killed, new information's coming out on this. CNN, other mainstream media were repeating over and over again that he was killed by blunt force trauma, that he was killed by someone hitting with a fire extinguisher. And now seems to be the case that that is not true, that is a false narrative. And, are they going to be banned on Twitter and Facebook now for, spreading false information? Is Facebook going to send its army of fact checkers to go and debunk them and downgrade them? Probably not, right? Because it fits their political interest. But it's important to note now, it seems to be the case that he died from inhaling the smoke they were using, that there were health complications from this. Let me explain a bit. It says, after nearly a month since his death, there was no evidence Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died from blunt force to the head on January 6th. Even CNN admits it's more likely he died from the effects of chemicals sprayed into the crowd that day. The media ran with the story that Officer Sicknick was beaten over the head with a fire extinguisher by Trump supporters. It was only later that the facts came out. ProPublica reported, not a conservative media, that Sicknick told his brother he was merely pepper sprayed. And according to Officer Sicknick's family, he suffered from a blood clot and stroke and was on a ventilator, according to Western Journal. Officer Brian Sicknick died on January 7th, the day after the Capitol protests, and immediately the media reported he died from injuries caused by blunt force to the head on January 6th. What does this mean? It means that the Trump supporters didn't kill anybody. It means actually that the people who died were killed by police violence, not by Trump supporters. Now, imagine if you had a Black Lives Matter protest at the Capitol building, and yes, there were violent protests in front of the White House. Remember that? Imagine if there were protests like that. Imagine if the day, remember when Trump, they said, gassed people, and again, they use tear gas and pepper bombs to go visit the church they had burned, the protesters had burned down across the street from the White House. Imagine if during those riots, right, police had killed 2 people, including an officer, and 3 people died of health complications. In other words, 5 people were killed not by the protesters, but by the attempts to put down the protesters. What would the narrative be, right? Do you think it would be that Trump is investigating Black Lives Matter and Antifa for domestic terrorism because 5 people were killed by officers on the site, directly or indirectly? Or do you think it would be that, 5 people were killed through the police response to the incident? And what do you think the narrative would be? How do you think that would unfold? This is what happened to Trump supporters on January 6th. It was not them who caused the violence. It was the response. Capitol Police, 1 officer, unfortunately, it's terrible, of course. It's terrible, but died, it appears now, from inhaling pepper spray and had health complications. 3 other people died from health complications. Unclear whether that's from the gas or from other issues, or who knows, maybe just had a stroke or something, maybe from stress. And then 1 woman shot and killed by a Capitol Police officer when you had 2 to 3 officers standing right in front of the doorway, and you had 2 to 3 heavily armed officers right behind her, meaning it was unnecessary use of force. What would the narrative be if the tables were switched? And how is it the case that it's the Trump supporters now being investigated for terrorism, domestic terrorism, based on that? All right, this is political framing of incidents using false narratives, false reporting to really go after what are in this case mostly innocent people. Frankly, ridiculous. This is fake news. Again, CNN spreading fake news, being used for political narrative to target innocent people. for exercising a right, although breaching the Capitol building, you're not protected on that, but people peacefully protesting, right? You are allowed under our Constitution to, again, right, peacefully gather, right? You are allowed to gather and protest, right? The right to assemble, right? This is what you're allowed to have. You are allowed to assemble, right? This is one of your protected rights, and that is now under siege because of fake news. Because CNN retracted the statement because of fake news. And the president himself is going to be impeached on this as well. Or they're trying to impeach him, I should say. Very, very unlikely, again, they're going to have the votes for it. And on this, to explain a bit more what's happening, right? At the same time this is happening, another story here, Black Lives Matter and Antifa are marching through Washington, D.C., chanting, "Burn it down." Now, Trump supporters were being called out just recently. You might have seen the viral video of them talking about attacking the media. You have Black Lives Matter and Antifa walking through Washington, D.C. right now chanting, "Burn it down." Is this being used to frame them as domestic terrorists? So they're calling for arson in the nation's capital. And they said this, right? They said, "We are here tonight because Black Lives Matter. Despite Black Lives Mattering, Black people are still dying at the hands of police paid by our tax dollars." Well, it seems that Trump supporters actually just died at the hands of police, but that doesn't seem to be the narrative right now. And they said, "Burn it down" in their chants, right? Another story here. This is Fox News. Tucker Carlson saying, "Bank of America handed over customer data to feds following Capitol riots." And you've seen this as being part of the investigations. You've seen kids getting doxxed, having their personal information released by their parents. And you're having media and government celebrate this. For anybody who's lived under communism, that should shock you to the core. You saw that under the Soviet Union when kids, told on their parents and their parents were executed and the kid was given a medal for it. Now, and then have fun living in the orphanage, little Don Johnny, right? That's what was happening under the Soviets. You had the same thing happening in China, to the Chinese Communist Party, right? Same thing in China, where the Chinese Communist Party was calling for different movements to target rightists, right? They had the anti-rightist movement. So if anyone who supported the four olds, as they called them, could be called a rightist. Old religion, old belief, old customs, old traditions, right? In other words, if you believed in traditional culture, you were a rightist. And there were kids telling on their parents, reporting on them to authorities, and the parents were, executed or otherwise gone after by the government, and they were congratulated. You have the same thing now happening with people who attended the January 6th protest. Again, the protest where Trump supporters were killed, officer died of complications from the gas used by the officers, and the media is using that to call it a violent protest, when it was the actions to put it down that were violent. Let's be clear, right? Now, Bank of America, big business institutions are helping in this effort to target people. Now, how many of you remember after, for example, some of these different shootings, like the one in Riverside County, where you had a terrorist go and shoot up some places, when Apple refused to, for example, decrypt the cell phone used by the shooter, a terrorist? How many of you remember businesses saying they could not release information and decrypt information and release private information on customers because it goes against, their beliefs, and they think it's a downward spiral? Now they don't seem to care, right? Now they don't seem to care. They're going after people, reporting people on others' behalf, and so on, right? Bank of America now getting on this. Now, another story here, not directly related, but important here as well, right? This is from Technocracy News. It says here, IMF, International Monetary Fund, calls for internet search to be linked to your credit score. And it says here in a blog post courtesy of the International Monetary Fund, IMF researchers Arnon Boot, Peter Hoffman, Luke Levin, and Lev Ratkanovsky called for internet search history to be tied to credit score. Presenting their findings from a paper they wrote, the researchers argued that by using non-financial data, specifically the history of online searches and purchases, we can solve the problem of certain kinds of people not having enough hard data, income, employment time, assets, and debts available. Where did they get this information from? Well, probably websites, Google, social media, so on, that collect this type of information, which can be purchased by customers. If a bank, for example, wanted to purchase this data, would the big social media sites sell it to them? Maybe, right? And what kind of information would they have on you? Political interest, names you follow, search history, every website you visited, including on safe mode or whatever name they use for it, purchases, books you've bought, interests, clothing, so on, which politicians you support, which ideas you support, which websites you visit. And what happens then if they start saying, well, this should affect their credit score? This and this and this mean that they're unsafe individuals and their credit score should be lowered. Where do you see things like this? This is the Chinese Communist Party's model of social stability under what they call, again, the social credit system. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to promote that as one of the global systems of governance. And you see now many countries starting to implement parts of that system, including in Australia, where in Darwin, Australia, they're actually putting into use to an extent the actual Chinese Communist Party social credit system. They call it smart city software, right? You're seeing this in different countries already, and through our technocrat leaders of the business community, we're seeing businesses talking about basically building the same thing. And you're seeing them, aside from all of that, basically acting like mini governments where they're determining what kind of speech is allowed, what kind of freedom of assembly is allowed, and so on, right? That businesses are starting to play the role of governments, and they're starting to become the gatekeepers of the rights they believe you and I should or should not be allowed to have. Now, this isn't to say they're going to definitely do it, but they're planning on doing it. They're talking about doing it. And it should be criticized, I believe, because if left uncriticized, well, it's unchecked, right? All right, folks, let me go over a few questions. It's getting late, and then we'll call it a night. This is from Joy Yoli. You said, what do you think of the video Mike Lindell released? I thought it was very interesting. Those of you who saw the documentary I did as well, I cover a lot of the same grounds. Mike Lindell gets a lot of people testifying, giving their own take on it, very professional interviews. I thought it was good. And we'll have to see what happens with this going forward because, again, we're going to be seeing a lot more on this, actually. Really, we're going to be seeing a whole lot more when it comes to the elections. Keep in mind as well, the Supreme Court is, as we speak, considering hearing some new cases, including from Sidney Powell, including from the Trump team, including from, sorry, my mind is going on me. Basically, the Supreme Court right now is going to be hearing, or at least considering court cases from all the major players that we heard of before. These things are still going through, many of them still in the works. We'll have to see what happens with them. No guarantees on it, no guarantee they're actually going to hear it, but these court cases are going through, challenging the integrity of the 2020 election. That is still happening. Let's see, this is from Paul Harvey. He said, Joshua, do you think the reason Pelosi wants to impeach Trump so bad is because she knows who the real winner is? I think they're acting in a way that would suggest that. And there's a book just out of my reach where I could grab it. None dare call it treason. I have it right over there from John A. Stormer. And again, great quote in it, right? Linwood, one of Linwood's lawsuits is among those considered. Just real quick, John A. Stormer, right? An old quote, basically that says, heck, let me just grab it. A little awkward. Sorry about this. All right. Not to be too awkward. Sorry about that. John A. Stormer, none dare call it treason. A few of you have asked, I mentioned before, I'm going to be doing this book list. I haven't forgot. Give me some time to think about it, but we're putting it together. Now let's see here. None dare call it treason. And why is this, right? Yeah. Basically goes into the idea, right, in terms of the initial quote, that if treason takes place within a system, right, if treason actually takes place within a system, none, and if it succeeds, none dare call it treason. And why is that? Because calling it treason is not allowed if the people who committed treason win. Because if you call it treason, you're calling into question the legitimacy and the criminality of what they just did. None dare call it treason, right? Now, how many of you dare criticize what has been happening in this country in a public forum at this point? How many of you dare go out and protest, based on what you're seeing happening in this country, right? I wouldn't say none dare, but I'd say few dare at this point. And why is that? Right? It's because you're afraid they're going to go after you. Right? None dare call it treason. All right, folks. It's getting late, so I'll call it a night. Now, I haven't forgotten again about the book list. And again, I've been talking about it for a while now, but we're actually doing it. We're going to be putting together a series, which we're going to be making into bigger production, maybe doing smaller episodes, 20 minutes-ish, publishing then as a full documentary once it's finished. The kind of forgotten history of communism and explaining some of this history that a lot of people don't know about. Maybe we'll do a few of them depending on how the first one goes, but we'll have to see. Working on that, I'll get a book list together for y'all because I've been asking for it, and I mentioned I'd do it. All right, folks, as always, again, this channel has been totally demonetized by YouTube. We'll have to see what the future of YouTube is. Hopefully they give us back our monetization. We're going to have to see this month. Whether they give it back to us, we can contest it. We'll have to see, because they didn't actually tell us specifically why they demonetized us. They just said a channel within our network, right? They just said like a channel within our network violated their terms of service. They didn't even tell us which video or anything. They just said, go and delete the video. Okay, which one, right? Yeah, great. What, delete like half our videos or something? They don't tell you even where to start. They just said one of your videos violated across all of your channels on Epoch Times, essentially. One of them violated the terms of service. They don't tell us which one. They said you can go and delete it. Okay, which one again? Hopefully we'll get back on. We'll have to see. But folks, in the meantime, if you do want to support Crossroads, we do have a Patreon and we do have a donor box. I recommend donor box because we've seen how even how Patreon can be. You can find the link to our donor box account in the link below this video, donorbox.org/crossroads. And we'll have to see what the future is with YouTube. Best case scenario to keep us on here. We frankly, I have no problem with YouTube if they don't censor us. Hopefully we'll stay on. In the meantime, please still do like this video and consider sharing it. It does help us. And in the meantime, folks, again, we're looking for other options. We'll have to see what comes up. But as always, appreciate all of you. I always enjoy talking with y'all. Tune in again tomorrow, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Be here again doing the broadcast as always. As always, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. Americans gradually losing faith in the different institutions this country is built upon, including now the electoral system, and including now as well the systems of justice. Now, America, on both sides, people are concerned about the integrity of our country, the integrity of the systems this country is built upon. And going forward, this country needs more than ever to find a way to reconcile with this corruption as they observe it, whether you're Democrat or Republican, observing politicians they believe do not represent them, observing justice systems they believe have not acted in accordance with the grievances they brought to them. The country right now is in a state of disarray and a state of hopelessness. And moving forward, I think more than ever, people need a ray of hope. People need to realize and understand once again and see proof of it, that the system represents their interests, that the representatives we have in these offices represent the American people and not personal interest, that the systems of elections represent the will of the people and not the will of a handful of individuals who may not be willing to hear information or be willing to look at information. The United States is in a very desperate state right now. And for the world as well, this goes even deeper, because America was the beacon of hope. America was the model of a free society. America was the system on which the image of a free and open society was built. And many countries look to the United States as a model for their own countries, their own model for what a free and self-governing people look like. That model is now being damaged. That image is now being damaged. And countries are now wondering what model to look at. As we go forward, the Chinese Communist Party very likely will use this. The Chinese Communist Party will very likely try to rebuild itself. And the CCP's China model, as they call it, will become a competitor to the US model on the global stage. This is where the United States and the world are now at.